America, 1943. In kitchens that once smelled of roast and gravy, the air now carried something quieter, a scent of cereal, milk, and memory. A woman stood by the oven with a bowl of ground beef. Not much, barely a pound. Into it she poured half a cup of milk and a handful of crushed Wheaties cereal. She mixed slowly, shaping it into the outline of a T-bone steak. The grain stuck to her fingers. The smell was faintly sweet. Outside, the radio mumbled headlines of the war, Tunisia, the Atlantic, blackout drills. Inside, she placed the pan beneath the broiler, and for a moment the sizzle almost sounded like the past. They called it emergency steak, a meal born not of hunger but of ingenuity, a quiet way to pretend that life somehow was still the same. The steak had once been America's pride, thick, bright, and endless, a symbol of prosperity. But by 1942, even that symbol had been drafted into service. After Pearl Harbor, the government created the Office of Price Administration, and with it came a new word for dinner, rationing. Each family received small books of stamps, red for meat and fats, blue for canned goods. Every cut of meat now carried two prices, money and points. A pound of ground beef cost 7 points, a porterhouse steak 12. Even if you could afford both, you often couldn't find either. Factories once making cars and radios now forged tanks and bullets. Tin, rubber, and fuel were swallowed by the front lines. And as ships crossed oceans with soldiers instead of sugar, the home front learned that abundance had limits. The emergency steak became one of many recipes printed to help families cope. In 1943, Betty Crocker's Your Share hit shelves nationwide. It taught Americans to stretch meat, to feed 5 mouths with what once fed 2. The recipe called for imagination as much as ingredients. Milk to soften, cereal to thicken, hope to season. The directions were plain. Shape the meat 1 inch thick, broil at 500 degrees, turn once. The cereal would darken on the outside, forming a crust that looked real. It wasn't fooling anyone, not really. But that wasn't the point. The point was the ritual. Setting the table, calling the children, cutting a slice that looked enough like what they missed. They would laugh sometimes. "This one looks like Texas," someone might say, or "at least it's steak-shaped." Then silence, the kind that comes with gratitude. Because what mattered most wasn't taste. It was the act of still calling it steak, of refusing to surrender the word. Rationing had changed not only the pantry, but the pace of life. People traded stamps in secret, sugar for coffee, coffee for meat. Posters declared, "Food is a weapon, don't waste it," and waste became unpatriotic. Even grease was collected. 1 pound of saved fat, the posters said, could make explosives for 4 bullets. So, households scraped pans clean, storing every drop in jars labeled "for victory." The emergency steak fit this new arithmetic perfectly. It needed little meat, no butter, and no imagination to explain. It was a patriotic dinner, a way to help soldiers by helping yourself a little less. By summer, even those who hated the recipe made it anyway. It was the sound of duty, the hiss of cereal against heat, the quiet applause of making do. Still, a single steak, even an imaginary one, was never enough. Canned foods had vanished, fresh ones too, so people went outside. Across the country, backyards turned to victory gardens. By May 1943, 12 million families had them. Eleanor Roosevelt planted hers on the White House lawn. In Boston, carrots replaced flowers. In San Francisco, cabbage rose through fog. Even rooftops sprouted rows of beans. The smell of earth replaced the smell of roast. And the emergency steak came to the table beside something green, a small reminder that life still grew. Those gardens produced nearly as much fruit and vegetables as all of America's commercial farms. They filled jars and shelves, but they also filled a space that hunger had emptied, the sense of control. The steak might be half illusion, but the garden was real. Together, they made a meal that felt like victory. Not everyone had the same chance to adapt. On the West Coast, more than 6,000 Japanese-American farms stood silent behind fences. Their owners had been sent to internment camps. Ironically, their gardens inside those camps became some of the most productive in the nation. Rows of cabbage and onions feeding the very war effort that had displaced them. Elsewhere, hunger found loopholes. 17% of the country's meat flowed through the black market, sold by meatleggers who charged cash, no coupons. The government called them traitors. Most people called them practical. Meanwhile, restaurants still wasted what households treasured: crusts of bread, butter wrappers, uneaten plates. The contrast was hard to swallow. At home, people stretched ground beef with cereal. Downtown, hotel kitchens scraped plates into bins. The war asked everyone to sacrifice, but it never said evenly who would. August 1945. The radios finally changed their tone. The war was over. Noise filled the streets, parades, whistles, the sound of relief. But in kitchens, the silence stayed. Ration books still sat in drawers. Sugar remained scarce until 1947. Old habits refused to fade. Some still saved grease, just in case. Some still cut bread in half, even when the loaf was whole. And many still shaped ground beef into the old T-bone form, because it felt honest. A small memorial to the years when invention kept everyone fed. Across the Atlantic, Britain's rationing would last another 9 years. Americans had it easier, they said. But the truth was simpler. Scarcity had changed what abundance meant, and some part of the war stayed behind, right there in the kitchen. Today, the recipe lives in old cookbooks and museum drawers, printed on yellowed paper in red ink. It reads like a joke now. 1 pound of ground beef, milk, cereal, bake hot. But for those who made it, it was no joke. It was proof that a family could stay whole on half the ingredients. They stretched their meat and called it steak. Not out of pride, but perseverance. They kept the name because giving it up would mean something worse than hunger. And maybe that's what the emergency steak really was. Not a meal, but a mirror. A reflection of a nation that refused to say it was starving. A story of what happens when you run out of plenty, but not out of will. In the quiet of a 1940s kitchen, the oven door closes with a hollow clang. A shape that once meant luxury now stands for endurance. Steam rises, thin and hopeful. It smells, faintly, like victory.